refugees right now, and our campuses and laboratories are bombed. Nevertheless, we want to show that Ukrainian academia is resilient, that we stay strong with our nation and our government, and we keep doing what we know how to do best. We can produce knowledge, discuss knowledge, and share it. And we also think it is very important to talk about what is going on in Ukraine right now in this era of misinformation and Russian propaganda. We have to come together and discuss in details with top intellectuals and diplomats what is happening now in Ukraine and around the world. And to this end, we have a very special guest today. We have Ambassador Thomas Pickering, who is a very famous diplomat. He have had a lot of diplomatic appointments in his career. He served as the US ambassador to the United Nations, but he also served as ambassador to many different countries, including India, Israel, Nigeria, and Russia in the early 90s. So he has a very broad expertise in diplomacy and international relationships. And today he will be answering to our questions. And the discussion will be moderated by Professor Timofey Milovanov, who is the president of Kyiv School of Economics. He is a former minister of economy in Ukraine, and he is a professor at Pittsburgh University. So Timothy, I will pass the word to you, and you can talk with Ambassador Pickering. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador. So perhaps I'll start with the question, do you think it was possible to do something in the last 2 years, realistically, to prevent the invasion of Russia? So what could have been done diplomatically, economically, politically, to avoid this situation?
Thank you. It's an excellent question and not an easy one to deal with. I hope you hear me well.
We do.
I have had a little bit of the sound cutting in and out, but that I think will be okay. First, let me tell you how much I and the people of my country admire what's happening among Ukrainians in support of their own country and their determined resistance to the Russian invasion. In that sense, you are in many ways a David fighting a Goliath and doing so with significant success. And much of what we see gives us heart to believe that your ability to hold out against this invasion is one of the key leverages that might be able to produce a solution short of capitulation and unconditional surrender, now seemingly demanded by the Russians, although one is not sure with Mr. Putin what any demand or what any agreement might mean. As for your question, I made those few comments as a backdrop because of the deep uncertainty that all of us feel about the situation which has now been engaged, and therefore, whether had we done other things in the 2-year period leading up to the invasion, it could have been avoided or not. I don't think there's a clear sense in our country or in its policy that such would have been possible, although there are things that one way or another could have potentially counted in the pre-invasion diplomatic exchanges that might possibly have made a difference. In all honesty, I don't join the optimists among those who, in one way or another, characterize the pre-invasion situation as malleable, as something with which we could, Ukraine, Russia, NATO, US, perhaps done much to fend off what seemed to have been a kind of messianic and highly irrational impulse in President Putin's mind that he had to take over and control Ukraine. And his remarks about Ukraine not really being a country and some deep sense of subservience.
Ambassador, can you hear us?
Serving to Russia, and therefore it would have been avoidable. Own feeling is we had less than good communications between the United States and Russia. Are you still here?
Yeah, we can hear you, but with some difficulty. The connection
It looks like you, are you still here?
The connection is not very good, but we can hear somewhat. Yeah, we can hear parts of what you say.
Yeah, unfortunately, we have some difficulties with the connection, so Ambassador will reconnect.
Should we try to connect through phone, maybe without video, but then have a conversation?
We can try. I will contact him now.
Okay, thank
and
you.
we'll see what we can do. Well, Ambassador is here. I will connect to him independently as well.
I am hearing you now. Can you hear and see me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. If in fact this goes bad again, it may be that the phone is a better medium for audio than the computer. That's been true in my situation here for some time.
Maybe
but let me keep on. I'm going to mute my video.
Okay, good. Thank you.
That should help. So the simple answer to your question is, I don't think so. One could speculate endlessly about various things that might or might not have been done. Could Minsk have been improved? Could something else have happened that in one way or another might have saved the situation? My sense is that the decision that was made to invade Ukraine was made a long time ago. It may have been postponed by some of the revelation of US intelligence that it was coming, but it was not easy to fend off, and it will not be easy to end, unfortunately, because while I hope that I could bring you good news, I don't think that is good news.
Thank you. You also served, I'm going to go a little bit sideways, or, on a margin,
Go wherever you like, yeah.
Yeah, not immediately on the US or Russia or Ukraine, but no one talks about the Israeli perspective. You served as an ambassador to Israel, and perhaps you have an insight on the position that Israel might take in the future, or currently is taking. The Prime Minister of Israel tried to mediate in the first week of the war, and also the President of Ukraine yesterday spoke to the parliament, but there are mixed reactions about how well that was received. What do you think the role and perception and position of Israel will be in this conflict?
Professor Breek, it's complicated. I happen to have been in Israel a week ago, the first trip I've made for 2 years. And I had a chance to speak to some, but obviously not a wide range of Israelis in a short 2-day visit. I spoke to one individual, a very distinguished journalist who had him interviewed, Naftali Bennett, the prime minister, after he met with Putin. He had very little to tell me about what Mr. Bennett might have claimed to have been forward progress. And so I assumed, in fact, that there was no forward progress. I would say that on the one hand, Israel is condemned to be a fence sitter on this issue. The one side of the fence for Israel is Syria, the Iranian presence in Syria and the Russian presence in Syria, and the established now many-year connection between the Israeli military and the Russian military with respect to Israeli air attacks in the main, often standoff air attacks against the reception in Syria of advanced weaponry from a number of sources, as well as Iranian activities in Syria, which Israel feels threatens its frontier and its obviously continued existence and its capacity to defend itself. On the other side, the Israelis have a very strong and very deep relationship with the United States. And there is a heavy dependence on the United States, despite the fact that Mr. Bennett, as opposed to his foreign minister, comes from an Israeli political trend, which is quite far off on the right, and as a result, bound itself under Netanyahu to President Trump, and subsequently has sought to revive a US relationship which soured, particularly with the Democratic Party and President Biden. Biden understands the value and the nature of the Israeli relationship. Israel has significant, through its donor community, which is quite heavily fastened to the right-wing in American policy, significant influence in American election politics, and we are never more than 2 years away from a significant election. So I would say, in brief summary, Bennett sits on the fence. He can lean one way or another, but does not have a significant capacity to change or influence major outcomes where people like President Putin may be deeply dug in. He can be useful for exchanging messages, as indeed can other interlocutors, but making those messages into action plans is a lot harder. Russia has experienced a huge amount of isolation since the invasion, but at the moment that does not seem to have picked up with respect to leverage. And we could talk about the progress or lack of progress in the Ukraine-Russia conversations, with which you're much more familiar than I am. But I would say, just to end this discussion of Israel, that also is a very hard diplomatic problem, but that I have a sense that President Zelensky and his negotiating team seem to be handling that with a great deal of care and with a great deal of thought, with limited success, if I could put it this way.
Thank you. I have a series of short questions, which I'll put together as one question, and you're probably expecting it. In your view, how will the war might play out? How long will it take to end? Or is it just an episode? Will Ukraine be split? Will Putin fall?
It's a short question, but a very complicated one.
Of course.
And a very difficult one to answer. And if I knew the answer to that question, I would be a lot more celebrated for genius than even I was in your very kind introduction. My feeling is that the longer you are able to hold off the Russians taking over major cities, the more punishment you will receive, but the more difficult it will be for Putin to continue and defend himself, first and foremost in Russia. My deep sense, and I haven't hidden this for years, has been that Putin's primary motivation is to gain enough strength and leverage with the people of his own country that he is not threatened with losing power. And I think that remains an important piece. The other policies he's pursued, ultra-Russian nationalism, certainly creation of spheres of influence, becoming once again as the Russians thought they were, or as the Soviets thought they were, among the two largest great powers in the world, dividing Europe from the United States and seeking wherever he could to exert his influence in world activities are all subsidiary steps, but they influence the question of the war ending and how and in what way it ends. If, as Mr. Putin demands, and as I don't see as happening, Ukraine were to offer unconditional surrender, it might end quickly, but the remnants of what is left would be disastrous. If, in fact, it ends up with a division between Russia and Ukraine, which I think is likely, and President Zelensky has showed that he is not, put it this way, totally oblivious to, totally unaware of that potential possibility. That will take longer, both in the application of leverage against Russia, including, in my view, as much of the cessation of oil and gas exports as possible. But in addition, something the US seems to be reluctant to try, an effort to drive oil and gas prices down so that Putin doesn't derive benefits from the invasion, which are double-sided. On one side, higher oil and gas prices, on the other side, conquering territory in your country. And so that is something that I cannot predict, but I hope that a combination of those leverages, economic, cutting off central bank access to finance in the dollar zone, trade limitations as strictly as possible, particularly oil and gas, international isolation politically, as happened in the United Nations General Assembly, and very significant continued support directly for Ukraine, but also for US NATO partners in East and Central Europe to do everything we can to guard against both further expansion and, as much as we can, Russian victory.
Thank you. What would you recommend Ukraine does? What should we do?
It's an extremely tough question and a dangerous one for any non-Ukrainian to undertake. But my feeling is that what you have done so far is the beginning of a strategic roadmap which is well conceived for your very difficult position. And that is, in the military confrontation, for as long as you can, hold out as much as you can against the loss of primary assets to your country, its survival and its economy and prosperity. Have your people who need to save themselves for the future by becoming refugees and seeking help from the world community to help them survive. Do whatever the world can do to help you provide for military resistance. Keep your contacts with Russia open and communications flowing. Without being in communication, you cannot detect either any weakening of the Russian negotiating position and or take advantage of it. And my feeling is that you have a better chance of ending the conflict on a more favorable basis by seeking to exhaust diplomacy while at the same time defending yourself. The alternative is merely a military battle without end, endless destruction. and no ability to use the kind of leverage that you have created, even against a much bigger adversary, to find an answer to the problem. Now, I'm a long way away, and you are experiencing this firsthand, and you should be telling me the answer to that question rather than the other way around.
Yeah, you just turned the table and said we should be answered. But I kind of agree with you that we have to do both, exhaust Russia and try to cut as best the deal as possible when they are ready. My fear is that they still think that they will be able to take either all of Ukraine or have Ukraine, maybe the Euro stay independent, but de facto submit. So I think
there is a suggestion, it comes from Henry Kissinger, but others of us have talked about it. And the question there is a very difficult one for you, and one that you have to answer, not anyone else. Henry suggested Ukraine would be a bridge country. And by that, without translating it himself, my sense is that some of the elements of a bridge country would play in to the answer to the question you just asked me. And those elements would be something along the lines of having a status in the future for a time a bit more like Finland and Austria. And Finland has shown the capacity through careful diplomacy, through some acquiescence with Russian interests, and through building up a military capacity beginning with the 1940s war that has created some deep sense, if not of admiration and respect, at least a deep sense on the Russian side that Finland is not a good place to attack because you don't win easily in 3 days there. And the second question is economic. And I'm not an expert on economics, but it would seem to me, as you know better than I, that some years ago, the contest between joining the EU and joining Mr. Putin's economic association, limited as it is, was essentially one of the antecedents to the problem, and could be dealt with in the bridge country arrangement. I'm not exactly sure how, but it might be worth at the right time to take a look. Could Ukraine have an association on both sides of the economic border, so to speak? And would that be compatible? Would the EU accept a limited association? Would Putin accept a limited association? Would you benefit in terms of trade through or based on Ukraine's economy in both directions? In the Soviet Union, you had considerable linkage with the rest of the Soviet Union, but principally the Russian Federation in economic terms. Is that revivable? Can you live with it? Can it be limited in terms that do not in one way or another infringe essentially on your sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity? And coming out of all of that are the questions of things like territorial integrity. How and in what way do you deal with the future of the Donbass and Crimea? Is that something that in one way or another ideas of autonomy are admissible and applicable? Can you have a country that has a strong central government, but with significant elements of local authority dealing with various pieces? Can you have a country where some oblasts may be different in their governance than the others? Or do you need to have a federal system much like ours in the United States, which at least has a constitution with the theory of equal division for equal administrative parts? I don't know the answers to those questions, and I don't know whether, in fact, they would become current at a time when it became clear that some negotiated settlement was likely to be put in place, as opposed to continued destruction of Ukraine in hopes that the Russians have that the so-called Chechen approach, which I saw firsthand in the early 1990s from Moscow, would in fact answer the question. It didn't for the first Chechen war, it took the second Chechen war. It was a terrible way to proceed. It had no humanity related to it at all. And on the other hand, it did result in a kind of workout, which didn't go very far in satisfying the needs of most Chechens, although it was satisfactory to the Russians. Those are the kinds of things that, in looking down the road, if there is to be a negotiated end to the arrangements here that have been put on your head, then looking at those questions is an important piece, and deciding which lines you will not want to cross are critical in that particular kind of a problem.
Thank you. How would you, I know it's too early to ask, but how would you negotiate something given that Russia, reneges all the time?
A very difficult problem. But let me say this. I began at the beginning of the Cold War with being lucky enough to have my second assignment after my first year as a diplomat to involve negotiations with the Soviet Union over disarmament and arms control. And we asked ourselves that question before entering in to any discussion of any kind of a relationship. One of the subjects was an end to nuclear testing. And the key question was, we had such distrust of the Soviet Union, particularly through the early days of Stalin in the Cold War, that we felt there were questions that diplomacy could deal with that would help create the notion that trust could be built if there were verification, monitoring, and control, but that it could not absolutely guarantee good behavior. Better behavior was guaranteed by the fact that both sides were invested in a solution which they thought was preferable to a military conflict, and particularly in the nuclear age, where a deep sense of concern about a military conflict was that if one began by accident, miscalculation, or misperception, it was very hard to figure out a way to stop it. And if it continued, the degree of destruction would be more than of bilateral significance between the Soviet Union and the United States. It had planetary significance. And therefore, if there were very small chances of that happening, there was a very large reason, if I could put it that way, to seek to avoid it, not in capitulation, but in mutual realization that there were places where military force and bad behavior could not go, and where they were not in the long-term interest of the countries involved. And I recall over American history that President Truman, who followed Franklin Delano Roosevelt near the end of the war, was asked what were America's vital interests. And he said, survival and prosperity. And that was how he defined them. And in some ways, that's not a terrible definition of what your vital interests might be, whether it's Albania, Ukraine, US, Russia. And so in a way, how in effect you organize a negotiated relationship does make a difference. The US in that sense has a capacity to put on the diplomatic scales a balancing factor that can be of assistance, but it has to be handled with a great deal of care. And in many ways, a piece of the negotiation, if it moves from where it is now to something more substantive, and there are public hints it may be, has to take into account your question and how you shape the negotiations, as well as build in verification and monitoring so you know it's coming apart if it is coming apart, and how and in what way the globe is prepared to react to coming apart. Now, Putin has tested in a way that we haven't seen before global tolerance for irrational behavior, if I could say it that way, hazarding the globe, not just us and you, but the whole country, the whole globe, with the idea that somehow the use of nuclear weapons has a capacity to affect the outcome in a way that he could live with or that is favorable to him. I think that's really very bad strategy and very bad policy. It puts us in a much more dangerous shape and in no way guarantees that any country, whether it's the first or the second to use nuclear weapons, is going to be, put it this way, the beneficiary in real terms. And for 70 years, both with the Soviet Union and Russia and the United States and NATO, we have hesitated to venture into that very difficult part of the problem. One final thing I would add is that there are areas of difference between Russia and the US and NATO and Ukraine that cover a wide spectrum. So we could say strategic armaments and strategic stability. We could say intermediate range ballistic missiles and medium range missiles and what role they might have or shouldn't have in Europe from the Urals to the Atlantic. The configuration of conventional forces on both sides of the divide in which your country exists in the middle of can give us assurance that over a period of time, resort to military force is not an answer that can in one way or another determine conclusively the outcome of the problem. And that's very much in test now. But it involves many countries and it involves lots of players. And working out the future for Ukraine and what it might be in this so far bilateral contest, but in which a lot of other people are deeply interested, is another part of the set of problems. How those issues get thought about and linked together, and how they can provide either mutual advantage or disadvantage in a negotiation, is something that I think does need to be thought about and talked about, particularly on the side of NATO, the US, and obviously Ukraine.
Thank you. So what do you think will happen, or how will the NATO be affected by this development?
NATO is heavily affected by this development. The first has been obviously a quite serious and unexpected rapid movement of NATO to seek to coalesce and bring itself together from its previously semi-fragmented position with respect to the fact that everything was going reasonably well. That means, in effect, that NATO has become exactly what Mr. Putin accused it of not wanting to see it become, a much stronger, much more allied, much more willing to invest in its joint defense than it was before. And what's one of the downsides of his move that clearly has to be applied, in my view, has never had intent, but it, in many ways, that have in one way or another. Are you still hearing me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, one way or another brought about what I would call unhelpful and difficult misperceptions, which have added to things like Putin's decision-making, which I think have brought us to where we are. And that part is interesting. I spent 3.5 years in Moscow, and the whole time I was there, and then the whole time since, I have never seen Russians absorb essentially NATO's rather strenuous efforts to convince them that NATO was not an aggressive anti-Russian force waiting to pounce, but rather defensive. And of course, NATO enlargement added to Putin's arguments. NATO felt it had its own reasons, although when I commented from Moscow in the mid-1990s to the American State Department, I said, you need to be cautious here that expansion is not something that's going to be easily seen. But I'll tell you another part of the story. I speak around the United States frequently about Russia and its situation. Often people request it. And it's interesting because often it's the third question that an American stands up and says the Soviet Union has just done thus and so, which is not in our interest. And so the American inability to drop a sense that Russia is inexorably and 100% the Soviet Union, and Russia's inability to understand that NATO came as a defensive alliance and is not interested in aggressive actions, remain as pieces of a very difficult puzzle to solve. And they don't fit very well, if I could put it this way, on the jigsaw puzzle board, if that American simile is something that can illustrate that factor.
Thank you. Timothy Brick, perhaps you have a question or two I wanted to add a little bit. Otherwise, I'll go back and ask a question.
Sure, we have actually 2 questions prepared by our audience. This question's perhaps quite general. So what I will ask both of them, and maybe we can build up from there. So the first question is very broad, and it's just about your perception. What has changed since your service as an ambassador to Russia in the 90s, and and now, do you think that the culture of diplomacy has changed? Do you think that the nature of relationships between Russia and the United States has changed? Like, what are the key changes which you can comment on? This is one broad question, and the second one is about this idea. Perhaps you have heard the speech of President Zelensky, who suggested to create a new international institution, U-24, as a new security alliance. Do you believe that we need more or new revitalized alliances, or you believe that we should simply, improve what we have? So how can you react to these questions? Thank you.
Yes, let me begin with President Zelensky's U-24 idea. My feeling is the larger the organization, the more difficult it is to bring together, particularly when they have to face hard issues. That NATO, for a long period of time, at now 30, it's grown, is perhaps better attuned to that, even though it is a European organization and not as universal as I understand President Zelensky might see the U-24. I was also ambassador in New York at the United Nations for 3.5 years and worked in the Security Council. And the fundamental problem of the Security Council is that none of the 5 so-called great powers who are permanent members is willing to give up the notion that it must have absolute authority to block through the veto any action taken collectively against it. My own feeling is that rather than create new G20s, G7s, G8s, G5s, G3s, G2s, U-24s, and so on, one ought to see whether we can repair the house we currently live in and deal with the fundamental problems that exist there. The UN, in recent weeks in connection with Ukraine, has operated under the Uniting for Peace resolution in the General Assembly, which was put in ostensibly to deal with Korea and a potential Soviet veto there. So I would leave my answer there. I think studying what people might propose with respect to new institutions should first be applied to how can the ideas for new institutions be best applied to repair existing institutions, where we have overcome the question of bringing in the membership, hopefully, and where therefore we are worried more about the substance and the process of their cooperation than we are about starting from zero. Now, others will argue starting from zero gives you the opportunity to write in a new clean book. And that may be true, but all the ideas, if I could phrase it that way, that exist among whoever might join a new institution are not a new clean book. They are old ideas and old protections and old mechanisms and old preoccupations. Key changes in diplomacy. The second question I've chosen to answer your first question is very significant. I think that I should say that I saw the evolution of the Cold War before I joined American diplomacy, but watched it during American diplomacy and spent a special amount of my time, not all of it by any means, in the idea that arms control and disarmament had to be worked at between the two major contestants, protagonists, as a way of avoiding a global catastrophe. And you can see from my answers to some of your questions, I'm still heavily influenced by that. And I think that over a period of time, in a kind of roller coaster ride with successes and failures, we managed to build a structure that added to stability, but perfectly. And some of that has got torn apart at the end of the war, and in a period where people seemingly cared less about the catastrophic potential of making mistakes and hadn't created a tragic mistake, we were safe forever. And almost anything could be done against that backdrop without paying attention to continuing to build stronger security on a mutual basis and stronger lack of use of force as a primary prerequisite to solve problems. And while it is not, in my view, something that I find it convenient or helpful to say, it is important you understand that a large majority of Americans have now analyzed our two endless wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, which finished in August of last year in the main, but is still not over in some parts, as serious mistakes. That use of force is not the answer for diplomatic problems. and that the use of force in one way or another, while it might add leverage to diplomatic resolution, still requires people to sit at a table and work out the political requirements of a solution, or to accept the consequences of a diktat. And those choices seem to me to be obviously in favor of at least trying the negotiations to make that happen. And so we have lost some of that quite seriously. The US has a school which believes it had a moment of unilateral superpower. To me, that is self-delusion. There was very little, if anything, we could do about almost all major world problems without having friends and allies, without bringing others into the conversation, without dealing with those who left out of the consultation might themselves become opponents rather than supporters. And so multilateralism is not a new invention. And tripartite multilateralism or bipartite multilateralism or whatever form it takes, U24 or G7, is in many ways a much more serious preoccupation now in diplomacy than it was. And despite the fact that simplistic thinking might take us back to things that were more bilateral and diktat than they were hard negotiations and the use of the new mechanisms that came out of things like verification and monitoring and so on, where we have gotten better to make that happen. But I leave that with you as a few thoughts. There are other minor aspects of that, I suppose, that a long discussion might well reveal and make more significant.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Pickering, for your answers and for this conversation. We are running out of time. And I would like to again say that we appreciate a lot that you have spent this time with us and provided your expertise and knowledge about the international affairs. And to all who have joined us online to listen to this conversation, I ask you to follow our social media, Facebook and Twitter, and tune in to our following lectures of solidarity. We will have we will host the next lecture on Wednesday and then on Friday. So thank you very much, and Ambassador Pickering, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Breek and your colleagues, and thank you for excellent questions. It's been an honor to speak with you, and you have to know that you and all Ukrainians remain in the thoughts and hearts of our country. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Take care.